What is he name?
Assalamu alaikum everyone. I am Manahil Rimarja Wali and I am delighted to welcome you all today's interview and I am hailing from Karachi, Pakistan. We have the privilege of hosting our distinguished guest, Professor Stephen Bronner. He holds a prestigious position of Board of Governors Professor of Political Science and Rutgers University and resides in the vibrant Fort Lee, New Jersey. Today, we have the unique opportunity to delve into the life journey and insight of this remarkable individual. So, now let's begin our conversation. Welcome, sir. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Thanks for the kind introduction.
It's my pleasure. So, sir, first of all, please introduce yourself for my viewers.
Well, at the moment, I am a Board of Governors Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Rutgers University, but I am emeritus. I retired. And I retired in order to basically co-direct uh, the International Council for Diplomacy and Dialogue, which is an NGO that engages in mediation efforts, advice for different organizations and governments, and educational efforts as well. So that's what I'm doing at the moment, besides writing. Um, so retirement has been very good, and I've never been as busy, although there's less stress.
All right, sir. Thank you so much for your introduction. So, can you tell us about your journey in the field of political science and how you become a board of governors professor at Rutgers University?
Okay. Uh, well, let's see. I was born in a very well known neighborhood of Manhattan called Washington Heights. And as I was growing up, this was composed completely of German Jewish exiles from the Nazis. So I wound up actually speaking German before I spoke English, although I was born in the United States. And this clearly had an impact on what came later. Uh, I knew many people who had been in the concentration camps. And so I was interested from the beginning in human rights activity and uh, basically anti fascism and anti authoritarianism in different forms. So I went to uh, a high school where I didn't quite have much academic interest in anything. And in fact, a guidance counselor told me, Stephen, you better get a job. So, but I didn't listen. And I went to the City College of New York, which was an extraordinary uh, experience. At that time, it was known as the Proletarian Harvard, and it was free, and which is today almost unimaginable in the United States. And there, I met. I started out thinking, well, maybe I should become a doctor. Um, but I realized I had no talent for that. And a friend of mine who was in the Students for a Democratic Society I was talking to him one day and he said, what are you doing? You're wasting your time on something you have no talent for and you don't even like. Come on and uh, start thinking about things politically. That's what you like. And so I did. And at City College, I met a remarkable uh, mentor named um, Henry Pachter, who he had been in his youth, in the 20s, in the Communist Party. Then he joined the Socialist Party, became close to Willy Brandt, the former chancellor of Germany. And he was one of these European intellectuals that don't exist anymore. He knew everything. You could talk to him about philosophy, sociology, history. He was a historian of politics, and he was also active in the French Resistance and in the Spanish Civil War. And he wrote a memoir about it. At any rate, it's from Henry that I learned about the socialist tradition, and also about critical theory. And these two intellectual themes would stay with me. When I finished at City College, I went to University of California at Berkeley for my PhD. And I wrote it on existentialism. And three philosophers, Martin Heidegger, Karl Jaspers, and Jean-Paul Sartre, who is one of those thinkers who saved me or made me what I am best in works like The Age of Reason and many of his philosophical writings. In any event, I went to Berkeley, and to my shock, nobody was really into the socialist tradition, and there was hardly anyone who was involved in critical theory in my department, although two very fine professors were there. Martin Jay, who is the preeminent historian of critical theory and what's known as the Frankfurt School, and also Leo Lowenthal, who was a member of the original group that worked on critical theory at the Frankfurt School. He was a sociologist of literature. In any event, I received a Fulbright in 1973, long before you were born, and I studied at the University of Tübingen. And I studied with an extraordinary, I had great luck with my professors. I studied there with Ernst Bloch, who was, I don't know, at that time as famous as any philosopher, literary figure in Europe. Bloch wrote The Principle of Hope and The Spirit of Utopia. Those are his best known works. And he is the great philosopher of utopia. And interestingly enough, he also had an enormous influence on the Green movement in Germany. His student was Rudi Dutschke, whom I became friends with, who was perhaps the preeminent figure on of the anti-war student movement of the European left. He was a remarkable character who was basically assassinated, shot in the middle of Berlin. And a few years later, the bullet was still in his head. He was in the shower, slipped, and the bullet moved, and he died. An extraordinary person who embodied the best of the humanist Marxist tradition, I must say. For your audience, I think it's also worth noting that Bloch wrote much on religion. He wrote a work on atheism and Christianity, and it was from him that I first learned about the great Arab thinkers or North African thinkers like Avicenna and Averroes and Al-Farabi. It was an extraordinary experience. Came back to the United States after about a year and a half, and finished my PhD at Berkeley. Started publishing a bit about the Frankfurt School and critical theory, and then got a job at Rutgers University, the State University of New York, where I taught for over 40 years. And I was lucky enough in my teaching. I was lucky enough to receive a number of awards. And I also had about 50 doctoral dissertations. I think probably certainly the most in my department, and arguably the most in the social sciences there. And some of my students have become brilliant and well-known scholars. People like Manfred Steger, who is an expert on globalization, Michelina Shai, who's worked on internationalism and human rights, Judith Grant, who wrote a seminal work on feminism. I could go on, but if a teacher is judged by his students, I feel very, very lucky. And I think at the end, I'll come out all right. In the meantime, while I was there, the basis for promotions in the United States are mostly writing. And I guess I started out with writing about the socialist tradition. I translated the letters of the great selected edition of the letters of the great libertarian Marxist Rosa Luxemburg, whom any progressive should know about. Her most famous line is, freedom is only and exclusively freedom for the one who thinks differently. And I think that's really applicable today. In other words, civil liberties are fine, but they're only really valuable when you make use of them. Then I wrote Socialism Unbound and some larger works of critical theory and its theorists, as well as various other studies of political figures that interested me, such as Albert Camus. I wrote a work on the political crises that forged European politics in the 20th century, called Moments of Decision. And anybody who's interested can simply Google my writings. What matters, though, most, I think, is activism. I had started out when I was young, inspired by the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King Jr., the great international figure, and but also the anti-war movement. In other words, the movement that sought to pull the United States out of Vietnam. And I think it struck me even then, although I was still in a phase where I was learning about European politics. And I just want to interject with one thing for your friends and for other students. No matter what you are, politically or ideologically, you have to know your tradition. You have to know the best of your tradition. Not every person, not every great figure is progressive or relevant for today, but each tradition has enough figures of the past from whom one can learn about dealing with what is relevant today. So Um, then, at any event, with the anti-Vietnam movement, this was the first time I actually thought about genocide after what we've called the Holocaust and the tragedies of Auschwitz and Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen, the three of the dominant concentration camps under the Nazis. And also, I had learned much about the Gulag in the Soviet Union, concentration camp system set up there. I was very concerned about this kind of humanism or anti-totalitarianism, anti-authoritarianism from the start. And that also holds for my views on culture, which I'll perhaps talk a little bit about later. So during once I got a job at Rutgers, I became very active in the American Political Science Association, and along with John Ehrenberg, who teaches at Long Island University, and George Katsiafikas, who is now in Korea, and a number of other important scholars. I helped form the left-wing caucus of the American Political Science Association, which is still in existence. We put together its journal. We organized its panels, which had been going on for quite some time. And I did a number of events consistently as what might be called a still young public intellectual. Then what's decisive, I'm jumping forward, in 2002, I met a remarkable character. I like to think of him as the humanist version of James Bond. And his name was Dr. James Jennings. Jim was, I think it's fair to say, my mentor when it came to dealing with human rights activism. A month before the war, I and my wife, Ann Burns, were in Iraq, attempting to create protests against what was already becoming clear would become an American invasion. I, along with other friends and supporters, people like Kurt Jacobson at the University of Chicago, we wrote a great deal about a great many criticisms of the Iraq War. And in the process, I also helped found the internet journal Logos, which is still in existence. I've backed off of that. I have too much work. But I was one of its original editors, or one of its original editors and writers. And that also still exists. One of my students ran it for well over 2 decades, Michael Thompson, who teaches at William Patterson University. And in any event, with Jim Jennings, going back to that, after Iraq, I had the opportunity to go to any number of different places. We went to Syria, met with President Assad, This was before the Arab Spring, where we tried to, and I think successfully, tried to get some people out of prison. Along on that trip was Bianca Jagger, who also played a very important role. And we went also to Sudan and Darfur, where Jim was instrumental in attempting to free some hostages. This was in Darfur. We put forward certain peace plans. That didn't work so well, but we tried, and which is all you can do. With Jim, I helped get some medicine into Palestine, and I'm trying to think where else we were. We visited other places in the Middle East, and I ultimately wound up as head of U.S. academics for peace, and also advisor for Jim's NGO, which was called Conscience International. In the meantime, I was still writing, knock wood, and I started to focus really on bigotry and cosmopolitan humanism, as well as, which I saw as the connection between socialism and liberalism. By cosmopolitanism, I saw the roots, with regard to this, I saw the roots of all of this within the Enlightenment, which is too much criticized by, it's always been criticized by the right. It's directly contrary to fascism and authoritarianism. It's political theory. But it's become subject to criticism by many postmodernists and post-structuralists, and also, to be honest, by many within the different religious communities. I don't see it that way. I think the Enlightenment tradition, even though many of its primary philosophers were bigoted, were prejudiced, were people of their age, nevertheless, the basic values of the Enlightenment involve pluralism, which a commitment to the liberal rule of law, which is basic for democracy, and also a basic idea which I think should be kept, which is very important to keep alive, which is that progressive people, humanists, socialists, liberals, they should work for a less cruel world. That's true with regard to animals. It's true with regard to torture. It's true with regard to the way people treat one another. Bullying in the United States, for example, I'm very concerned about, precisely because it's so stupid. And even within religious communities, within very orthodox religious communities, concerns arise which demand a liberal response. For example, within the Orthodox Jewish community, there's a dissident. Same thing with the Islamic community. There's a dissident among you. Now, how are you going to treat him? Especially if you're living in a theocracy. What kind of laws would you use against him or in support of him? Remember, freedom's for the one who thinks differently, as Rosa Luxemburg said. These are questions regarding justice, whether it's equal, whether it protects the individual, whether it is proportionate in the punishments it lays out. All of these issues are not just there for the West; they're there for non-Western societies. And in any event, I think that is a matter of some importance. Finally, I know you're running out of time. Finally, I just before I retired, I met two people who are very good friends now. One is Mr. Igor Cutler. The other is Mr. Eric Goslin. Igor runs a museum for tolerance and human rights. And we met in Moscow, the three of us, working in some way in an attempt to battle anti-Semitism. I had written a work which is important for your community, I think, called A Rumor About the Jews, which is a study of the fabricated idea of a world Jewish conspiracy. I think that's, which has now been translated into a half dozen languages. And anyway, with Eric, we founded the International Council for Diplomacy and Dialogue, which, as I said, which I described earlier. And we've worked with any number of different groups in Yemen, among the Roma, among the Amara. We've worked in Guinea. We've spent a good deal of time and had quite an impact on Guinea. And that's what I want to continue. That's where I want to spend my time, working on human rights and writing further within the three great traditions that I laid out: the tradition of liberalism, cosmopolitanism, and socialism. And I hope that through my life, I've been able to turn some of its tenets into practice. I hope that gives you a sense of who I am. I'm afraid I can't hear you, Manili. My pleasure.